Hello, everyone, and welcome to When Docs Talk. Hello, Morgan. Hello, Sonia. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Hi. How are you?
Great. So, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to When Docs Talk. Let me tell you a little bit about who we are. We are a collaborative of emergency practitioners and providers, including nurses. We're based here in Atlanta, Georgia, but we hail from all across the United States and even the world. Miami, New York, Georgia, Jamaica, we're all here. What we're here to do is to bring to you information about subjects that matter, subjects that are trending, subjects that you have told us, either as patients, as friends, that you're interested in. So we will always make your voice and your interest heard. Now, for those of you who have been along this journey with us, you know that we've been here before talking about coronavirus initially, and then we launched into our segment on racism. The last time you were here with us, we launched our series, This is an Emergency, where we talked about racism from the front lines, from the perspective of emergency providers. And this is a 3-part series. Part 1, which many of you saw, was stories. So we wanted to get the stories of emergency doctors, nurses, and even people on the front line like police officers who just happen to be in Black skin. Part 2 is the one we're going to be talking about today, and that is supporters. A lot of times we talk about Black Lives Matter, we talk about social justice and racism and inequality, and we talk about it in our silos. Often people of color, Black people, we talk about it together. But the conversation, we believe, here at When Docs Talk needs to be expanded. We want to bring other voices into the conversation. It's time to bring our friends and colleagues who are not Black into this discussion, because we need to have honest conversations to learn from each other. I know several of my friends who are Black have mentioned to me that they received an outpouring of telephone calls, emails, texts from people who are not Black asking, how can we support? How can we understand? What can we do? And we appreciate that. And while we needed some time to heal because there was a lot of pain associated with what is going on in this country, we're ready to talk. A lot of us are ready to talk. And so we're so grateful to be joined by several members of our community who are not Black to talk about what the current situation is in this nation regarding racial harmony and injustice. So, before we get to that and bring our wonderful guests on, I want to bring my co-host into the discussion here, my co-host. So, ladies, for those who are joining us for the first time, please let them know who you are and what you're representing.
Hey.
Sonia, I think you're on mute.
I'm on mute. Sorry about that. So, hey, I'm Sonia Pinson. I'm a family practitioner, board certified. I'm working in an ER setting, also a United States Navy veteran. I'm born in Atlanta, raised in Peachtree City, and just glad to be here and be a part of this discussion.
Hey, my name is Natasha Morgan. I'm a registered nurse here in Atlanta. I specialize in emergency nursing. I originally hail from Brooklyn, New York. Been in Atlanta for 16 years, and I am super excited about being a part of When Docs Talk and excited about what everyone has to offer today.
Excellent. So there are a few of our crew that are not here that I wanted to just give a personal shout out to. We have a special congratulations to our own Liz Ilidare. She recently gave birth to a beautiful, healthy baby boy, Jonah. We want to wish her a very happy introduction to motherhood. We're so proud of her and happy for her, although we are missing her and her voice here. And of course, we have 3 of our members who are currently on the front lines. We have Davita, and we have Tawny, and we also have Yolanda Harrison. All of them are currently working today, so could not join us, but they are with us in spirits, and we hope to harness their opinions and their vibe, even though they're not with us today. So let's go ahead and move on. We could not really start this show or have this show, especially since we're talking about racial harmony, civil rights, without talking about the big losses to the Black community and to the national community that we've experienced recently. This weekend, we've lost 2 American heroes, two American civil rights pioneers, and we wanted to take a moment to just honor them on When Docs Talk. We'll start with the elder of the two, C.T. Vivian. C.T. Vivian, Corey Tyndall Vivian, was an American minister and civil rights icon. He was a close friend and confidant of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Vivian was born in Missouri, but lived in Atlanta, Georgia for much of his life, and it is there that he founded the C.T. Vivian Leadership Institute. Vivian helped found the Nashville Christian Leadership Conference and helped to organize the first sit-ins in Nashville in 1960, as well as the first Civil Rights March in 1961. He was also an active participant in the Freedom Rides, and as a result of his activism and quest for freedom was sometimes arrested. During the summer following the Selma voting rights movement, Vivian created and directed an educational program called Vision, putting greater than 700 Alabama students in college with scholarships. This program later came to be called Upward Bound. Vivian's 1970 book, Black Power and the American Myth, was the first book on the civil rights movement by a member of Martin Luther King's staff. In the 1970s, Vivian moved to Atlanta and founded Black Action Strategies and Information Center, also known as BASICS. It was a consultancy group on multiculturalism and race relations in the workplace. He also founded the Center for Democratic Renewal and Organization, where Blacks and whites worked together in response to white supremacist activity. Protesting and fighting for civil rights since 1947, C.T. Vivian has said, "Racism destroys more people psychologically and physically than any other factor in American society. We have not gotten over it yet." He passed on July 17th, just 2 weeks shy of his 96th birthday. When Docs Talk would like to honor this American hero, Reverend C.T. Vivian. As unluckiness would have it, we lost another civil rights hero, an American hero, and we'd like to tell you a little bit about him too. John Robert Lewis was a beloved American politician and civil rights leader who served in the United States House of Representatives for Georgia's 5th Congressional District from 1987 until his recent death in 2020. Born in Troy, Alabama in 1940, Lewis served as the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, and was one of the famed Big Six leaders who organized the 1963 March on Washington and played key roles in the civil rights movement. Lewis was one of the original 13 Freedom Riders. During his tenure as chairman of SNCC, SNCC opened freedom schools and organized voter registration efforts during the 1965 Selma voting rights campaign. In his quest for equality and civil rights, Lewis has been beaten and arrested several times in his life. In fact, it is recorded that he has been arrested more than 40 times in his lifetime. At the age of 21, Lewis was the first of the Freedom Riders to be assaulted in Rock Hill, South Carolina, when he tried to enter a whites-only waiting room. 2 white men attacked him, injuring his face and kicking him in the ribs. But just 2 weeks later, Lewis joined another Freedom Ride, stating later in life that we were determined not to let any act of violence keep us from our goal. We knew our lives could be threatened, but we had made up our minds not to turn back. He held a prominent role in Selma to Montgomery marches, and on March 7th, 1965, a day that would become known as Bloody Sunday, Lewis and fellow activists led greater than 600 marches across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. The marchers were met by state troopers who asked them to turn away, and when the marchers stopped just to pray, the police discharged tear gas and charged on the marchers, beating them with nightsticks. Lewis's skull was fractured and he bore the scars on his head from the time of that incident to the rest of his life. After many wins in the civil rights movement, Lewis went on to serve this country for over 30 years. He continued to champion equal rights for all Americans and unity. And even in his last days, he supported protests for equal justice and posed in front of the Black Lives Matter mural in Washington, D.C. He was a man of the people and made himself accessible to Americans everywhere. My own son in Sidibe even had the honor of taking a picture with this living legend because of Lewis's humility and love for the American people. From presidents to school children, he was everyone's hero. Lewis once said, "We are one people, one family. We all live in the same house. And through books, through information, we must find a way to say to people that we must lay down the burden of hate. For hate is too heavy a burden to bear." We lost John Lewis at the age of 80 to pancreatic cancer on July 17, 2020. And When Docs Talk would like to honor this American hero. May his soul rest in perfect peace.
Yes, we two great soldiers have gone on, but I mean, definitely getting deserved rest. But definitely, it kind of gives us a reason even to make sure that we go on with this race. You know,
Absolutely.
I think it has fuel. I think, as unfortunate and sad that their passing was at this time, I think it inspires us to fight harder.
Yes,
absolutely. So that their fight won't be in vain, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Right. I was talking to some people and they say they feel like there's such a deficit, such a void that their passing has caused. But certainly we have, and we should have the fire to find the energy to step into their shoes as best we can.
Yes, definitely. And maintain that energy that they had even up until
the fight continues.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What I loved about these guests, or these heroes, I should say, that kind of makes me think about our guests is that as much as they went through, as much as they saw, and I'm talking about decades of being arrested, being harassed, they still sought unity. They still reached out across the aisle to other people, and they still wanted to hear the voice of people who didn't look like them. And so I think we have to keep that in mind because there is power in opening our ears to others who may not look like us. And that's exactly what I want to do today. Are you guys ready to bring on our guests?
Absolutely.
All right. I have to say, to begin with, we're unfortunate that one of our guests was unable to make it. She had a situation in her household. We're praying for her, and we will definitely do this in honor of her as well. I know she had a lot of great things she wanted to share with us, but Karen, take care of whatever needs to happen, and we'll talk to you next time. So let me show you our guest, and we'll talk to you a little bit about who they are. We're so excited because they come from all walks of life, all ethnicities. We are excited to have a little mini UN here. So let me start by introducing Dr. Heval Kelly. Dr. Heval Kelly is a Syrian Kurdish-born physician who moved to the United States as a refugee 2 weeks after 9/11 and went from washing dishes across Emory University to completing his cardiology training in the same institution. His work is focused on advocating for underserved communities and inspiring the next generation of diverse doctors and leaders. His remarkable journey and work have been praised by President Obama, President Carter, and the United Nations Secretary General. He's been featured on CNN and several other national and international news outlets, and he tells WDT that he wanted to join to be a supporter and an advocate for social justice. We welcome Dr. Heval Kelly. Let's bring him on the stream. Welcome, Heval.
Hey, everyone.
Thanks so much for being here. We're excited to have you.
Oh, my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Great. Sonia, you want to tell us about our next guest?
I'm pleasure to introduce Dr. Jose Rosa. So he's a practicing emergency physician working in Northern California. He is an alumni of Emory Emergency Medicine Residency Training Program, and he is Grady Strong. Yes, Grady. So he's joining us today from Sacramento, California. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, Dr. Jose.
Hello. How are you guys?
Good.
How's it going?
Thank
We're
you for having
doing
me.
great. I'm doing great. How's it looking in California?
It's beautiful. Hot.
It's beautiful?
Yes.
Okay. Hot, beautiful. All right.
Hot and beautiful.
Karen was our next guest, but we've already talked about how she cannot make it. So we're going to move on to Dr. Bao Chung. Dr. Bao Chung is a practicing family medicine physician working in the Los Angeles area, so another Cali member. He joins WDT due to an interest in participating in conversations that build community. We were introduced to him through host and friend of WDT, Dr. Yolanda Harrison. They trained together, and we're delighted to have him here with us. Welcome.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, Dr. Bao.
Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. Who's our next guest, Sonia?
So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Poonam Sachdev. I'm very happy to say I can call her my friend as well as a colleague. So she's a practicing emergency medicine physician here in Atlanta. She also holds a master's in public health. So she is a native of Michigan, and she moved here to Atlanta to do her residency training here at Emory Grady program doing emergency medicine. Once again, Grady Strong. She believes that people of other ethnicities must show support for Black Lives Matter and would like to highlight some of the nuances of racism that we have today in the U.S. So welcome, Poonam. Thank you so much for coming.
Hi, guys.
Dr.
Thank you for
Sachdev.
having me. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. We really, really appreciate it. We're happy to have you here.
Oh, it's my honor. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to introduce the last two guests. The first one, Miss Kamala Avila Salmon, was born in Kingston, Jamaica, and raised in New York City. Kamala's career thus far spans marketing and entrepreneurial endeavors in music, film, television, streaming, and even board games. After graduating cum laude from Harvard University, she followed her passion for music back to New York and began her career entertainment of RCA Records and Bad Boy Records, founded by the legendary Sean Diddy Combs. Kamala took a short break from the entertainment industry to attend Harvard Business School, where she got her MBA and invented a board game, actually. Post-graduation, she moved to LA to pursue her dream to impact and influence powerful images and messages disseminated by Hollywood, working in marketing strategy for Universal Pictures and NBC Entertainment. She transitioned to the digital side of the entertainment ecosystem in 2015, working across a number of tech and streaming media companies and roles with focus on making marketing in those spaces more inclusive. When she's not at work, she's spending time with her husband and her son, co-chairing the Alliance for Young Professional Board, and writing about race, which is something we're really excited about because she has a very unique take on how we can talk about race with others. She also tries to get many of her side hustles in the D&I and media space off the ground. She's a busy lady, and we welcome her here. Hello, Kamala.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome.
I'm so excited. Hey, ladies. How are you?
Hey.
Hey,
We're
doing
doing
great. Good. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Great to have you.
Great to have you. So let's bring on our last guest, and that is Mrs. Ashley Abercrombie. She is a writer and a speaker and the author of The Rise of the Truth Teller, Own Your Story, Tell It Like It Is, and Live with Holy Gumption. For more than 15 years, she has worked in nonprofit spaces, leading faith-based initiatives and serving as a prison chaplain and pastor, also speaking at conferences, churches, and events. Having worked on dozens of books with other authors, Ashley enjoys partnering with new writers to help them edit content and write a winning book proposal. She's the co-host of a hilarious and helpful podcast called Why Though, and lives in Los Angeles with her husband, her 2 sons, and baby girl. Welcome so much, Ashley.
It's so good to be here. I'm honored. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. We know you're going to drop some knowledge on us and be a truth teller, as you say.
We hope so.
So let's actually bring all of our guests here. Hold on one second, because I do want a couple of people here in this conversation. Okay. And what I'd like to do, I like to start off this discussion by talking about the kind of things that tend to be a little bit, how should I say, triggering to Black folks. When we hear them, we get upset, and it's not always easy to articulate why. But what I want to do is a little different. I want to flip it, and I want to see what happens when you hear these things. Okay. Now, Kamala, I know you are also a Black person, but I bring you on because you're giving us a different perspective as somebody who often talks about race and also somebody who's not medical. So tell me what comes to mind when you hear all lives matter. I want to start with you, Ashley.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about that, because at face value, I think, and I'm going to play the contrarian the whole show today, all lives do matter, right? So what's the problem with us saying that?
So I think the problem with All Lives Matter is that it doesn't tend to Black Lives Matter. And I think that it's a way for people to shut down a very important movement. And it's a way for people to sort of set aside the thing that needs to be done due to their own biases and their own reasons, whatever's going on in them that would make them respond to Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter, whether it's their political ideology or it is the way that they've been raised. It's the racism or white supremacy that could be living in them that causes them to respond that way. And I don't, like, Black Lives Matter, we all know, obviously, is not saying that no other lives matter.
Right.
Right now, this is extremely important, and we need to raise the level of equity. And this is why we're having this conversation, not because we're trying to put down any other race.
Absolutely. You know, Kamala, when I posed that question to you, when you and I had conversations about it, you had an interesting perspective where you're, I want you to share that a little bit with me.
Happy to. So I think this is one of those statements that I think really gets to the heart of what is so uncomfortable for people. The first thing that this statement does is center Black people. As Americans, we are not used to Black people being in the center. We need them to be in the background. So merely asserting that our lives matter is a controversial statement to many. And the thing that I liken it to is nobody would ever go into a cancer benefit, take the mic and say, but I want to talk about AIDS right now. Like, think about how deeply bizarre that is.
Yeah.
Nobody with cancer benefit is saying cancer is the only disease that I care about, but we are gathered here today to raise funds for cancer. It would not be appropriate to talk about the rainforest. I think people know exactly what they're doing. It's the discomfort with centering Black lives, and it's an ability to pretend that they do not know what we're talking about, when in fact it only reveals that they do. They deeply, deeply do.
I hear you.
Yeah.
Ashley, I have a question that I wanted to ask you too, and I'll just throw it out to everybody. There is a camp. I like to go into circles that are a little uncomfortable, like on social media and so forth, and look and see what's being written, because I really do try and understand the perspective of others who may not agree with me. And the narrative that I hear a lot is racism doesn't really exist. It doesn't really exist. Not like it used to, not like John Lewis or C.T. Vivian used to experience. And I just want to get your take on that and get everyone here on here's take. Like, what does racism really exist? Or are we making too much noise?
Yes, racism is very real, and it definitely exists. Kamala, I hope I didn't jump in front of you. But it's real and it exists. And I think a couple of layers are going on here. I mean, we have an education system that has not changed for 50 to 60 years. And so people are taught not to think critically. We are being handed a narrative of history that is inaccurate at best and missing a whole heck of a lot of things. We do not talk accurately about the genocide of the country we are currently living in. We do not talk honestly about the enslavement and oppression of people in the country that we are living in. So people are able to take a narrative and run with it, especially white people are able to take a narrative and run with it from their classrooms, from the time they were little kids all the way up into adulthood, that is not fully accurate. And then I think along with not being able to think critically, we have, reality TV is driving so much of what we see, what we do. And people, again, they're not thinking critically. And then people in the generations before us were taught to trust law enforcement, to trust all doctors, to trust all teachers, to trust all journalists, all pundits. And so layer on top of that, this political narrative that we have and these polarizing narratives that are in the news and people being indoctrinated by what they watch 24/7. And if you watch news stations, you begin to literally internalize that as real and as fact, even though history and science can prove that so many things are wrong. And so I think you have all these layers to the issue of racism and why people say that they can't see it. And then the last thing that I think is a big layer is that many people, due to the crossover of maybe their gender or their economic bracket, along with race, do not have the opportunity to ever set themselves down in a different perspective or a different economic bracket, or maybe they don't have friendships with people who don't look like them. And so we make assumptions about other races, which allows us as white people to not do any work. We don't have to think about, are we wrong in this? Are we missing something in this? We don't have to actually be confronted with our own biases or the way that white supremacy has formed us from the time we were little. And so I think racism is very, very real. But same as you, I understand why people are able to carry the thought that it isn't, because this is how they've been raised. This is what they've been steeped in, and they don't know anything different. Although in 2020, if you don't know anything different, like, you are actively saying, you know what, I don't care. That I don't care. That's really where we're at right now.
Yeah, can I add to that? I mean, I think that, like, when you hear a statement like racism doesn't exist, you have to start first, I think, from the premise of, like, think about the level of privilege that is required to sit so far outside of racism that you have the ability and time to think about, is it real? Let me ponder that. Like, people who live in Black and brown skin don't have to host forums, run studies to figure out if racism is real. We live with it and we experience it every day. And so if I can use another metaphor, if you wanted to really understand the state of feminism, you wanted to understand how women are included in our society, would you ask a man to let you know how it's going for women? That may not be your most reliable point of contact, right? But I think that we live in a society where many white people feel it is perfectly fine to talk amongst themselves about whether or not racism is real. Like, what is our interest in perpetuating a narrative of racism? I would love for it to not be real. If I could solve racism on my own, like, Black people would have done it by now.
By now,
right?
Absolutely.
And so I think that what it is that there is discomfort in feeling like, if there is racism, perhaps I need to look in the mirror and think about how I am a part of it. Nobody exists outside of our society. Nobody exists outside of white supremacy. We are in it. And thinking about where you sit in that system is very uncomfortable. And many people would much rather just close their eyes and say, nope, that's not happening. Either because it is not happening to them, and because if it is happening to someone else, what does it mean about them?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And then just another quick question from the standpoint of reverse racism. The concept of reverse racism, is there such a thing as reverse racism? You know, from the standpoint, you see it sometimes on certain news channels from the standpoint of, even if somebody were to call a woman Karen, instances, oh, is that reverse racism because you're calling her that because she's white and what she's doing? I just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really big one to uncover. So one of my big things is that words matter and what words mean matter. Yeah. Racism, to me, the best definition of racism that really encapsulates what it means, it's a system of advantage and disadvantage that is based on race. It is the combination of discrimination, which is personal, and then disenfranchisement and disadvantage, which is systemic. So in the example of a Black person calling a white person or white woman Karen, that is a display of discrimination, perhaps, that is making assumptions about you based on your race. But what you can do is move on to the next person. What you can do is get the next job. If a Black person goes and is discriminated against from getting an apartment building, there's a lot of statistics that tell us that that will likely happen to them at every apartment building in that neighborhood.
Right.
If a white person is denied by the one Black landlord on that block, they can go to any of the others. They will not find a system that is systematically against them and against their progress. So to me, that is the difference. And that's why we cannot have reverse racism, because Black people and people of color do not have the systems to take personal feelings and have them, in fact, real life outcomes.
Yeah,
That's
we don't
a
have
very
the
good point.
power behind us in order to perpetuate those agendas to keep us away from things. So,
Exactly. Like
That's true.
racism is not about feelings. The
Right.
feelings are a part of it.
Well, it's not,
but,
it's
like,
a part of it,
yeah.
right? But it's not its entirety, and it's not the most important part of it,
No.
I would venture to say. Ashley, I wanted to ask you if you've ever felt, talking about reverse racism, have you ever felt targeted? Have you ever felt, that you were a victim, or somebody that you knew who looked like you was a victim of reverse racism, just out of curiosity?
I never have. I've never experienced it. And I shared this with you earlier, but the reason that I really began to understand the penny dropping for me around the issue of systemic racism is because when I became a prison chaplain, one of the first people that I ever met with in jail was a woman who looked like she had just been picked up on a Target run on her lunch break. And we were talking through the glass, and she shared with me that she had been picked up on an outstanding warrant, and she was unable to go to court because of what it was going to cost, and she was afraid she would lose her job. And I had been picked up 7 other times for warrants out for my arrest for very similar things. I couldn't go to court because I was afraid I would lose pay, et cetera, et cetera. And I realized at that moment, it wasn't any kind of favor on me. It wasn't any kind of grace over me that I didn't end up in jail, just like my sister. The only difference is that she was Black and I was white. Yeah. And so the only thing that I had favor in was my skin color. And so I think that, reverse racism is not a thing. Kamala's already said it. And sometimes I like to say that prejudice plus power equals racism. Mm-hmm. That's really what it is. And in most scenarios, Karen has a lot of power. We saw that with Amy Cooper. Had she not been videoed,
right, what
would have happened, right? And so we recognize that, reverse racism is not a thing. And I think if more people were interacting with these systems, they would understand that it's very real and that skin color does determine a lot of outcomes, along with zip code and all the other things that we know within our systems.
That's right. I want to ask one more question before we bring in some of our other guests, because I hear this a lot. Why should we be punished for what we didn't do? We didn't do slavery. We didn't have slaves. We don't own slaves. And I don't think it's right for us to assume punishment or guilt for something that happened so many years ago. I hear this a lot, and I'm just curious about your perspectives.
Gosh, I have so many thoughts. So I think the best way for me to kind of explain what is missing from that point of view is that I think that it's one thing if you think about racism as something that happened a long time ago that you have no part in, but the fruits of racism exist today, right? When we look at the wealth gap between Black families and white families, the only thing that explains it is centuries of being disenfranchised from the economic system, right? There is nothing that there's a study that was just recently released that while we can go to college and grad school, we can get high paying jobs, we can move into neighborhoods, we could go to schools, we can go to all of those things can happen. None of those things in and of themselves will actually effectively close the racial wealth gap.
Right.
Right. The thing that has to happen is actual intervention to figure out, diagnose what is that wealth gap? What is it coming from? Anyone that knows anything about finance understands what it means. If one had $1 in 1865, what does that mean about your wealth now? Black people in this country were the first group of people to start with 0. You're free. Bye. Hope it works out.
Right.
And let's also add in that systematically, it was criminal to not work for a white employer at that time. Yeah. It was criminal to try to vote and to own property. So how are all of these things supposed to add up? And then one day you take away legal segregation and say, I'm pretty sure it's all fine now, right? It doesn't work that way. And I think that what I would urge people to feel is that it's not about feeling guilt, right? It's about responsibility. It's about accountability. It's saying that though I've done nothing, when I walk into an interview, I am going to be preferred. So what will I do with that privilege that I have, right? How will I think about others that are not able to be in the room through no fault of their own? How am I advocating for a system of equity as opposed to blindly going along with the privileges that the society has afforded you through no doing of your own.
Absolutely.
So that's sort of how I would think about it.
And I love that perspective. Ashley, I'm interested in hearing from you. You know, I venture to say, I guess that you might hear this a lot. Maybe I'm wrong, but do you ever get that from people who look like you, who are white like you, who feel like there is an unfair burden that they have because of things that have nothing to do with them?
So I think that, you know, we have to come to an understanding of complicity and how we are complicit in these systems. And, you know, Kamala just did an amazing job of laying that out. And I think sometimes the downside to being an individual, right? Because white people get that privilege. And even though we're taught that in this democracy of America, that everybody is an individual and you can make your life whatever you want to, if you're unaffected by the systems like most white people in America are, maybe we'll leave some room and some margin for poor white Americans who may be called trailer trash, or the different things that, you know, the ways that they may be identified in a negative way in the system could be impacting them. So I want to leave space for that. But in a broad stroke, for the most part, none of us are. And so I think it's hard for people in this individual society where you can be an individual to make your own way, to understand that not everybody can, and two, that we live not just as individuals, but we are responsible to one another. We are responsible to the community. Like, this is, our communities need to be whole, and the way that they're whole is that we are not selfish individuals, but we recognize if somebody's hurting, I'm also hurting. If there's a child in my kid's classroom who needs some help, then we need to identify that, be okay with that, and figure out how we can help. And I'm not talking about like white savior complex. I'm talking about how do we, you know, restructure this so that the ground is level, instead of somebody's working from a ditch and somebody's working from a mountain. And that is unfortunately what happens often in our country. And so, you know, I don't think that it's a punishment on me or any of my family members or any white people to say, you know, like, hey, it's time for us to create equitable systems. It's time for us to do something that would enable people to get ahead without them having to be an exception to some rule, or without them having to strive and perform and kill themselves to get ahead. I just don't think it's right or fair. And so I don't hear that talk very often, because I think people know where I stand on some things. What happens, you start to become an outlier in your own group of people.
Right. I can imagine. I
see a lot of people deal with this. And it's also, again, news rhetoric, right? They're hearing this all the time.
Of course.
Yeah.
Again and again, because, you know, people often stay in echo chambers, so they hear the same narrative. Exactly. I really want to switch gears a little bit, because the next quote that you see here on the stage, I venture to say that I've heard a lot of times, not only from people who are white, but also people who are non-Black, right? Even Black immigrants. And that's why I want to bring on some of our guests who are either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants, because I want them to talk a little bit about this statement, because there's a lot of times when we will have divisions among people who are underrepresented because of these notions that are suggested by this statement. And so let's bring on some of our other guests. I see here, hold on one second. Here we go. Okay. So I think everyone on the screen right now, as far as I understand, is either an immigrant or the children of immigrants. Is this correct?
Correct.
Yes.
All right. So the question to you, because this is the quote in its entirety, listen, if you just work hard and you follow the rules, you can get to whatever you want to get to, wherever you want to be, and you won't get in trouble. I don't understand why Black people, and I've heard it like that, complain so much. Black Americans, sometimes they were described to, because I've heard immigrants from other countries who are Black say things like this. Somebody jump in and talk to me about this.
Yeah, this is a big one. I'll just jump in quickly because I'm Jamaican. I was born there and I was raised in the US. So I think I have the unique vantage point of, for the most part, feeling like and identifying with Black American people and culture, but being Caribbean. And I've definitely heard statements like this. I think it's so important to unpack. So I think a lot of where it's coming from is that when you are an immigrant, especially an immigrant from a majority Black country, the idea of systemic racism is so foreign to you.
Oh, yeah.
And for you are within your own country, part of the talented 10th. That's a lot of times how you got here, right? And so you're coming in with none of the context of what it means to be Black, but all of a sudden being treated as a Black person in America without any of the relevant history. And so I think what I would say to those people, and I hear it all the time, is I think those people really need to immerse themselves in understanding the history of racism in America, because it is truly distinct. And I think we also need to disabuse ourselves of our own anti-Blackness, because the media and society and education has sold us this story that Black people in America just don't want to work hard. And the receipts are not there. I think it's so shocking almost that there is a myth of Black laziness. When you think about slavery, who was working and who was sitting down?
Right.
It literally does not, but this is what we're told. And so I think a lot of immigrants come here and they hear the same things. And there just needs to be that really commitment to like really understanding what it means to be a Black American and how systemic racism works, even if it's unfamiliar to you.
Absolutely. Bao, Haval, Jose, Poonam, thoughts?
So growing up as an Asian, oh, you go.
Go ahead, Bob. I'll go next.
So for me, growing up
I
as an
think
Asian
we all
American,
know
you know,
that
this
this
is
is
what
not-
my parents have ingrained in me. Just do your studies, do your homework, you know, and then you're gonna become a doctor. And look where I am today, you know. So unfortunately, what this does, it does put you in a very straight mindset. If you work hard, you're gonna make it. But everyone else that didn't make it, what did they do? You know, so when you see the chaos that's going on in the U.S., it's really hard to believe. You do think that maybe Black people are getting harassed because maybe they haven't been studying, maybe they don't follow the rules. It does kind of put this narrative that if you don't follow the rules, that's the reason why you're getting punished.
And so you see that narrative because you're ingrained with this whole notion of if you work hard, then you'll get this. If you see other people who are not getting all the things that they should be, they must have done something wrong, is what it sounds like you're saying, is ingrained in certain communities. Okay. Jose, I know you started to say something. I think you both started at the same time, and then Poonam, jump in there.
Yeah. I was going to say that we know that this is not true. I mean, we've talked about stories, not only like last episode, but during, I think this episode, I know I'm going to share a story about, you know, we've done the right things and still, you know, we feel and we experience these issues of discrimination. And I've definitely felt that in my own life and experiences. I was with a cousin of mine who came in to go to Caltech for a visit. I was a med student. We were on campus and he was actually invited there to actually interview, and we were stopped by and harassed by cops. I mean, just because you've gotten to a certain place doesn't mean that, you know, these things stop happening.
Right. Do you
So in other words, you can do well, you can achieve, and still.
So, yeah.
Okay. Do you feel that within, I know that you were born and raised here in the States and your family is from El Salvador, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Do you feel like some of these
Yeah.
narratives sometimes cause friction between Blacks and Latinos, even though both tend to be targeted a lot of times?
The idea that if you're not working hard enough, that you're not, so the question being that if you're not working, or that, can you rephrase the question? Sorry.
Sure. I guess the better way to look at it is this. We've already established that a lot of people who are coming to this country get fed narratives that the Black people in this country do not work hard, and that's why they're being targeted. And I wonder if you sometimes hear that internalized in Latino communities, even though they're also discriminated against. Do you think that they still have those same ideas? Because the point I'm making is, I would venture to say that Latinos do get discriminated against too, but I still think that there's a little bit of friction sometimes between the two communities. And I wonder, is it because of the bad reputation that Black Americans are given, or is there something else there?
I think there sometimes can be a little bit of friction, and I think it's because when Latinos come in, they do get immersed in like the milieu of what is America, and both being in kind of marginalized settings that I feel that sometimes we like direct competition, and that can cause some friction. And unfortunately, I think it's just a product of all of the systemic issues that are part of our country.
Fair enough. Poonam, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I had a lot to say in terms of like retrospective review. You know, when you look at your parents who are immigrants, my parents immigrated from India in 1970 and 1972. And you look at people who are escaping maybe poverty, religious persecution, effects of war. They come to this country with a very small set of goals, which is economic security. You know, how do I make sure that my children who might be female get more opportunities? How do I make sure I have a consistent roof over my head, a job, food, a clean environment? You have a very limited set of goals, and you're looking at everybody around you with that same lens. Like, why aren't you just working towards that limited set of goals? Like, why are you asking for more? Like, you should be satisfied with just having like a nice house and your community around you. And then as you become more established in this country and start to see nuances of behavior either around you or directed towards you, you start understanding more and more, how do I fit in this society? Like, what is my place in this society? How are people treating me? Why are they treating me this way? And you develop a greater consciousness of the undertones of societal interactions around you, which I think is just because you establish that first foundational need of, hey, I have a roof over my head now. I think in psychology, it's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you start at the bottom, like basically just your human securities, and then you start looking at the relationships around you. And, you know, I'm very pleased to see the South Asian community starting to vocalize and verbalize more, you know, Black Lives Matter, like, hey, we have a place in this conversation, which
Right.
I can say, you know, 30 years ago growing up, I never heard or saw anything like this.
Okay, fair enough. Heval, I'm interested to hear your perspective, because you came here yourself as a refugee to this country and have been, you said, in situations where you were discriminated against in your country. I've spoken to you at length about this personally, and I just want to get your perspective on how people in your community might perceive the Black Lives Matter movement or Black people in this country and how they're treated.
I mean, I think everyone made a great point. I think we also tend to lump immigrant and refugee in the same kind of pile, and kind of like it's all relative, right? There's this immigrants who come in from top of their class, come to the United States to study. Those guys not going to understand what the struggle of any person who goes through like discrimination or, you know, socioeconomic status. And I have many friends like from the Middle East who do that. And then you have the refugee who come in of prosecution from their country and come for a new life in America. And the way you explain it to them, like, imagine if you stayed in your country with those pressure, you would not be a doctor or engineer today, probably. So you have to give them perspective, and you have to look at relative who's talking to you about this issue. I think that the biggest thing immigrant and refugee community is they have high respect for academia and educated people, and it's our job as educated people to speak up. So when I said Black Lives Matter on my Facebook, yeah, I might get some messages from people saying, why are you doing that? But 90% of people were supportive because they're like, oh no, now someone who's smart, who educate us is saying something, maybe we should listen. I think that privileged immigrants and refugees have an obligation to speak up against this justice. If they don't, then they're just living in the shadow. And I promise you, you are going to be the next who's going to be, you know, have prejudice toward. But
Right.
it doesn't just stop with Black. It goes around, you know, socioeconomically, different races, different immigrants groups. So I think it's important for us, especially physicians, you know, and again, you know, we complain about this whole situation going on in this country, but we as physicians were quiet when people on the border, their kids were put in cages. We were quiet when refugees were banned from this country.
There we
were
go.
quiet when immigrants were pushed away from the borders. I mean, there's so many things that was, and now all of a sudden, physician, like, why nobody is speaking up for us? Because we did not stand up for others. So the same argument goes for immigrants and refugees. If we don't stand up with the Black Lives Matter, whatever, like next thing will be Hispanic Life Matter, or like, you know, poor people life matter. We have to stand up in justice to be able to educate our immigrant community to speak up. I think that's our obligation as people we hear in this panel, other like us, to speak up to our community.
Well, the only thing I want to say about that, I think that's a great point. And there's a lot of times when we are silent, where we really need to be more open about our opposition, because what we don't condemn, we condone, right? But do you think that part of the problem when it comes to Black people specifically is that a lot of the racism that is directed towards Blacks is more subtle and harder to recognize? I mean, now we hear about, killings and people dying, and it's clear to some people that there is a problem with Blacks being targeted, and that's more overt. But do you all think that part of the problem, say like with the refugee population you were referencing, they're coming from a situation where they're targeted, persecuted in their own country? Is it hard for them to see that towards Black people in this country?
I mean, it's hard also, like you asking someone who just got through a major trauma to advocate for someone else. It's hard for people to realize that, like that's why I say the privileged and immigrants and refugees have that obligation. You can't ask someone who just come to this country 3 years ago working as a cashier to go rally for like injustice. They barely speak in English. They barely understanding the culture. So we always put pressure on the underserved, underprivileged to stand up, which actually the true power is not in their hand, is in the hand of people like us, educated with resource and privilege. So, and I think, again, like a lot of immigrants and refugees need to understand the reason why we exist in this country because of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement built the foundation for the 1965 Immigration Nationality Act, so people cannot be racially profiled to come to this country. So without the civil rights movement, we will not be here. So if we can understand that, we will have some sympathy and empathy with what's going on with the Black community and other oppressed communities.
I agree.
I was just going to say that, Halal. I think that there is a way in which so many diverse groups stand on the shoulders of what the heroes of the civil rights movement did. And in general, whenever we start talking about solidarity, I think it's really important for people to realize that Black people have always expanded the pie of rights in the US. Yes. Like, this is what we have done. We have paved the way for so many other groups to be included. And inclusion is not a zero-sum game. It's not like a pizza where if I take a slice, there's only 7 left. It's like we actually can grow the pie together. But that is another one of the ways in which white supremacy works. White supremacy is almost predicated on keeping us separate. It's predicated on making us see each other as the enemy. Yes. And it happens with women as well. Like, if the 7 women on the team are fighting for the 1 woman's seat at the head of the table, we're not thinking about the fact that there are 7 other seats that have been occupied by men, and why can't we have some of those? And so I think that we do need to start building more bridges across diverse groups in this country, because even owning words like minority, very soon we are not the minority.
Right.
We can't forever be in a minority state of mind. We are the majority. And when it comes to people under 35, we are already the majority. And I think that white supremacy does not want us to recognize that, but we must do so. And we will only be able to do it together.
Okay. I have another one for you all. I brought in Ashley and I brought back Sonia because I want to throw up another idea. And it is the notion of Black on Black crime. And I'm going to tie in another notion that's not on the screen because I want to talk about that too. First, I want to talk about the notion of Black people being targeted by the police. Is that a real thing? Because there's a lot of arguments surrounding that. And if it is a real thing, and let's say it is true that unarmed Black people are being killed by police or others at an alarming rate, why are we so upset about that and not upset about Black on Black crime? Those two things. So first question, as for the first question, are we really being targeted? I mean, actually, and I've heard this is a quote that I've heard, there are more white people who were unarmed who were shot by the police last year than Black people. So why are we so up in arms about it? It happens. It's just a few bad apples. And it is a myth. I've heard it described as a myth that Black people are being targeted more by the police. Thoughts?
Not a myth.
Not a myth. Tell me about it, Morgan.
It's not a myth because I think we're disproportionately ill-treated by the police officers. There are more white people than there are Black people. So our numbers are high. So it's easy to make a blanket statement like that. And I know who said it, but it's not true.
And then also, I know there was a study, and they ended up doing the stop and frisk in New York, but they showed that there was a disproportionate amount of African Americans, Blacks, and Latinos that were stopped. But at the time, even when they were stopped, they did not have any weapons, they didn't have any drugs, but they were being stopped, and they had that interaction with the police. And therefore, with those interactions with the police, there was a majority of the time also where there was brutality that was used to enforce that stop and frisk rule. So they have in turn stopped that, but the statistics show that.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned a study because I want to throw up a study. So the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences of the United States did a study just last year in 2019. And they looked at the risk of being killed by police force in the United States based on age, race, ethnicity, and sex. And Sonia, what you mentioned is pretty much what bore out in the statistics, right? You can see at the very top that men, particularly African-American men, had the highest lifetime risk of being killed by the police for 100,000 people, followed actually next by American Indians, followed by Latino, followed next by kind of other, and then white, and then Asian Pacific Islander. And what the study ultimately concluded is that people of color face a higher likelihood of being killed by police than do white men and women. And that risk actually peaks in young adulthood, as we've seen with many of the recent high-profile cases, and that men of color face a non-trivial lifetime risk of being killed by police. So a lot of times people talk about myths and they bring in passion and emotion. Sometimes we just have to look at the science. We have to look at what the data show us. So what about Black on Black crime? Even if we believe that this is true, that Black people are killed more when they're unarmed, why are we so upset about that? But we're not even upset about Black people killing each other.
Lord, I feel like these things were written for me personally because. So the first thing I would say is that like all crime is communal. There are not many people that are getting on buses and taking trains to the next neighborhood over to kill people that they've never met. We actually do have some people that do that. They're called mass murderers and they're disproportionately not Black. But for people who are in their neighborhoods, we live in a segregated country. So of course, like 80% of crime against white people is committed by white people. 80% of crime against Black people is committed by, like, this is true across all races. And this idea that nobody is upset about it, says who? There are tons of community activists and organizers that actually are working every day on trying to address issues that happen in the inner city that disproportionately impact Black people. But when you talk about Black on Black crime is not a thing, because white on white crime is also a thing then. Asian on Asian crime is also a thing then. Narratives mean things, and I almost wonder whether or not, like, is it because we just don't teach good math? Like, do people not understand statistics and trends and data? Because if I tell you that 100 people did this and 1,000 people did that, but I don't tell you that the total number of people in each of those pots is dramatically different, you can make some wild conclusions. So is the problem statistics? Because where I learned statistics, you actually need to know what the denominator is to know if the numerator has any bearing on the story that you're telling. So you're running away with your numerator and you don't even understand what the broader picture is. So I think that, like, we have to push back on even language like that. Black on Black crime is meant to make you think that there is something so deeply depraved about Black people that they would kill their own. If that is true, there's the same level of depravity in every race on the planet. Crime is communal. That's it.
I love it.
There's nothing more special than that.
Communal. I think that's a perfect explanation. I want to know from some of the other people on the panel about the next topic, which is a piggyback onto that. I've heard people complain, what about Black on Black crime? And then I heard people actually ask, what about all the Black people killing white people or Asian people or Latinos or others? Talk to me about that.
I think that this is a narrative that is really used for white people to shirk their responsibility and to shirk their complicity and to shirk their role in this. And I think it's a way for people to not take any responsibility and to not really have to look at themselves. And we have to be honest about that. And we have to know that that's really what's going on, because you don't hear anybody else saying, what about Asian on Asian crime? And what about this on this crime? Like, you don't hear it for any other people group. So to Kamala's point, it's pointing directly to this idea of us not wanting to deal with white supremacy, not wanting to deal with racism, not wanting to own our part. And that's really what this is about. And another thing is people, again, they're not thinking critically. They are listening to news pundits all day long. They are sitting there listening to this rhetoric. They are following it on Facebook. They are following it on Twitter. And they do not sit back for 5 minutes and just be reflective about the thoughts that are going in their head and the things that are coming out of their mouth. And they do have an echo chamber where nobody checks them, where everybody looks like them, where people are watching the same news, reading the same Facebook articles, reading the same Twitter feeds, and now the algorithms are only showing you what you are already looking for.
Right.
And people are being totally indoctrinated, and it is shirking responsibility, it is lack of accountability, and it's that full indoctrination that we see with news media and echo chambers.
Absolutely. I'm interested from, say, Bao or Poonam or Jose or even Haval. What are your thoughts on this within your communities? And I know that you all, this is another thing that happens to Black people all the time. We're asked to represent or speak for our entire community, which is ridiculous. I'm not asking you to do that, but I'm curious to know that in the circle, if in the circles that you are in, either family or even extended within the communities that you represent, just ethnically, do you feel that there is a fear of Black crime or Black violence that's perpetuated? I think, Jose, you're trying to say something, but I'm not sure if you're on mute. So sorry, Jose.
I have not heard.
Oh, there we go. I can hear you
Not
now.
on mute.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay. I have not heard it in my community, luckily, and not within my circles, though that idea of Black on Black crime or Black on another white, whether it be or Latino, I find very disconcerting and unnerving. It's a way just to like demonize a whole race, and it hasn't been perpetuated in many other ways that I have known, other than potentially actually I can think of would be like terrorists and Muslims.
Right.
And to do that just kind of paints an idea in our society of like a criminality based on race. And I find that so unnerving.
Mm-hmm.
But luckily I have not heard it within my circles and within my immediate family and people.
Okay. Bao?
I agree with Jose. Personally, I haven't had that fear of Black on Asian crime. I'm actually in my community, even in Arkansas, it was more likely Asian on Asian crime than anything. The rhetoric, it does drive this fear. I agree. And I think it's a myth. I agree. It's completely a myth that Black on Black crime is a thing. I agree with Kamala, how she stated it.
Poonam, how about you?
I was thinking, I can't remember if it was Kamala or Ashley talking about the media and kind of how the media is like this echo chamber for redundancy. You know, I grew up outside of Detroit, and the news is always like, you know, Black on Black crime, right? And so then you go into these gatherings, which are mainly, you know, South Asians, and you hear the dads or the uncles, and they're all just repeating the news stories, right? And then you see how, as a child, like these stories then become narratives that people say to each other. Again, this was pre-Facebook, where they believe these facts because that's what they're being told by the local news. And it goes back to how insidious the system of white supremacy is, because it comes from the news, it comes from the standards of beauty, it's kind of all around you. Yeah. And as a child, you're not really understanding it, like you can't really verbalize it, but you're putting your finger on something that something's not quite right. Like this narrative is not quite right. Like these are not all the facts.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why we're all scientists, because, you know, we want to know what are the facts.
Sure. Fair enough. Another thing, Scott Holder, I think it was, who put up the last comment. Thank you for your comment on WDT. But he raised a very good point. Going back to this whole issue of Black crime and Black on Black crime and Black on other crime, at the heart of it, there's also something to be said about poverty and lack of resources. And we have to also recognize, and aside from the fact that people tend to commit crime within their own community, so that's a whole nother issue, we can't absolve we can't absolve the dominant culture from the responsibility that they share in creating situations where people are struggling, sometimes desperately, for resources, or creating situations where people are taught not to respect themselves, that they will amount to nothing, that they are not worthy of living, and then expecting them to always be judicious and respectful of their lives and their counterparts' lives. I think that that's something we don't talk about a lot. We get upset and we say, well, you know, Black people kill Black people and Asian people kill Asian people and white people. But let's talk also about the things that make anybody commit crime in this country of any race. And at the root of it, you scratch it, you'll see poverty, you'll see desperation. And that is part of the problem that racism creates too. And we can't ignore that. I just wanted to bring that point up.
Well, then also from the standpoint, even with the level of segregation, I mean, now, I mean, you know, we're seeing where people are discussing even redlining, and how suburbs were created in the nation, as well as from the standpoint of making sure that Blacks weren't able to get loans to buy these homes.
Right.
So from that standpoint, you're creating a situation where you're putting these people in pockets where they're segregated, they don't have any resources. And then on top of that, you know, you're increasing policing, you're determining that their behavior is not what you want it to be, but however, you're not giving them anything to do any better, but that then you point your finger toward them. And then on top of that is generation after generation where other people are allowed to be able to give their people, their children, generational wealth based on the homes that they were able to buy based on programs that were created in order to segregate people and to exclude Black people. So it's all of that is totally connected when it comes to poverty. Just even the ills of segregation, we still have not been able to overcome that. Once again, okay, we're integrated. Okay, aren't y'all happy? You know, everything is fine. No, it's not, because even now, based upon the city, even in Atlanta, how our interstates were built, it was built in order specifically to segregate Blacks from whites.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yes, yes.
Like, that's so true.
The New York Times actually in their 1619 project did an article on it. And that's a lot of cities in America in which we're trying to, even to this day, recover from that. So these are things also that are so deeply entrenched within our culture. And it's going to take a long time for us to get over that. And the only real way to deal with it is to discuss it and be honest about it.
Be honest about it. I'm glad you kind of brought up history, Sonia, because I want to throw out a little bit of a history question for you all. This comes up a lot, and here's another triggering comment for me.
Yes.
Why do we have to tear down history? The Confederate flag is not racist. It's part of history. These monuments are not racist. They're part of history, and we really shouldn't tear them down. Now, I know we have a few Southerners on the group, but even non-Southerners, feel free to comment. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm going to let somebody else talk first. I want all.
My deal with this is that the Confederacy lost.
The Confederacy lost.
Yes.
So we shouldn't honor the losers. Is that the perspective? Sorry, I hear you say the Confederacy lost, but I think we're losing you a little bit there, Jose.
Having flag an enemy, an opposing side.
I'm so sorry. I think your connection is not allowing us to hear what you're saying. But if that gets fixed, you tell me what you're saying. But what are some other thoughts? Because I have my opinions. I definitely agree that it's a losing flag. But I'm not just talking about the Confederate flag. I'm talking about monuments, statues, and I want to know what your thoughts are. Like, should we take these down? Because they are, in fact, a part of history.
Yeah. Well, I mean, from the standpoint, I think, you know, people like to, it's kind of mythical from the standpoint of the narrative that they're creating. But from the standpoint of, even though, yeah, it was based upon treason, the concept of the flag, but also, why did they start flying the flag again? Really, why did they start putting it on their capitals, incorporating it in their state flags, as well as all of those monuments? It was during the time in which they were trying to integrate schools, to pass, you know, to be allowing people to vote. it was a way to subjugate people and to also disenfranchise people and let people really to show people this is where your place is. It was a source of intimidation from the standpoint of, listen, this is what we really think of you. Yes, you're sitting here trying to become integrated, but this is what your place is. This is what we think of you. I mean, and if you look at it, even schools in the South, if you look in the most poorest rural places that have the majority of African Americans, they have schools named Robert E. Lee.
Right.
After Forrest, he was the head of the KKK. So from that standpoint, let's just be realistic about it and why they were doing that. It was out of retaliation in which they put these monuments up. There's totally different ways of dealing with history. To me, monuments are to celebrate someone. If you really want to discuss history, put it in a book.
Or a museum.
Yeah.
Or a museum.
She's at a museum.
Someplace not where people have
we're going to have to pay for it.
Right.
Like at the end of the day, let's be realistic from the standpoint of really what the purposes were for those monuments. And they need to get rid of them. That's my stance on it.
It's such a disingenuous embrace of history. And it's such a cloak of like trying to avoid the issue that you're talking about, Dr. Sonia, which is about actually confronting where these monuments and symbols come from. We know that even when I was in high school, we were taught that the Civil War was a battle of states' rights. One of the rights was slavery, but it was mostly about, it's like, no, they actually went to war specifically because we're moving in a direction where maybe they wouldn't be able to own me. That is what happened, right? That was an 8-year or so battle that now is so mythical in the minds of some people. This is my ultimate history. It's like, you're telling me a lot about you that is your ultimate history. But if we were a nation that was truly committed to history, why did so many people just in 2020 find out what Juneteenth was about?
Yes.
Why do so many people still have never learned about redlining
at all?
It's like, we are not committed to history. You are committed to a preservation of a certain set of ideologies, at the root of which was anti-Blackness and racism.
Absolutely.
Own that. Just be upfront about that. And I totally agree with the person who said monuments and statues are for celebrating things. Yeah. So tell me what it is that you are celebrating and why we should all be subjected to being unwilling celebrants with you in what Jose perfectly described as like, that side lost.
That side lost.
So unusual.
It is.
Right? I want to see us have historical monuments that are about things that we actually still believe and celebrate.
Yes.
And this is not one of them.
Not one of them. And Sharon Ashley from Facebook actually just had a comment. Hitler is a part of history, but I don't see any monuments and I don't see any celebration, which brings up another point. Why or what other countries, maybe I'm ignorant and just don't know, but in what other countries do they celebrate people who were considered the villains? Yeah. I'll just put it like that. You know, those who tried to secede from the Union, those who tried to enslave other people. I'm not aware of any countries where they do that. In Germany, I know it's against the law to fly a Nazi flag, is what I understand. So I think it is a cloak. I think that it's very disingenuous to say it's about history. I think a lot of times it's a cover for trying to entrench racism. But I'm just out of curiosity, if you guys can share with me. I also don't know where else in the world they do that.
Well, in South Africa, they do have a statue of Cecil Rhodes.
Okay.
And if you know their history in South Africa, but definitely they do a better job in discussing their history of apartheid and even dealing with reconciliation. And, I feel like we could really take some lessons from them.
I agree.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I want to shift gears a little bit because we're about to wrap up the show, but I definitely want to talk about this because it's going to segue us into our coronavirus update that we want to do. But I want to talk about the history of racism in medicine. So historically, Black people, not just in this country, but throughout the world, their bodies have been used experimentally. There's been surgeries that have been performed on them without their consent, without any sort of pain control. And because of this, there is a deep entrenched distrust of the medical establishment, much to my chagrin, being a physician. I hate the fact that the profession that I'm in, oftentimes people who look like me don't want to seek care through that system because of what has happened historically. So we had on our last show several Black doctors talk about their experiences in racism. I want to know what your thoughts are about race in medicine. And I'm going to actually start with you, Bao, for two reasons. One, I know that you're going to have to be leaving us soon. But two, when I spoke with you, I had a very interesting conversation about how race does have a role in medicine, and it's different depending on how you look. So I know myself as a Black doctor, I was telling you, I'm often questioned and they want to check my credentials and so forth. But you told me that you had a different experience.
So there are studies that show that patients will be more likely to trust their doctor, take their medication if the doctor is the same race as you. So, you know, I do have Asian patients obviously looking for me, but fortunately, I'm not sure if it's fortunate or not, Asians do also have this stereotype that they are good at math and science. So I've actually had white patients as well look, they see me, that I'm an Asian doctor, and all their other doctors are Asian, and they actually have a positive experience when they see me. So it does matter when you look for a doctor of a certain race. The patients do seem like they're more likely to trust you. They're more likely to take your medications. The diabetes can drop if they're following your recommendations.
Mm-hmm. So it helps with compliance. I mean, if a patient trusts you, believes that you're there to actually care for them, they'll actually have better outcomes in terms of their healthcare. And it sounds like you're saying that there have been situations, as what you told me, that where patients seek you out because you're kind of a model minority. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. I'm not saying it's a good thing, not necessarily, but that's just my experience. The other thing about that study also is that the doctor, if they can identify with the patients, they're more likely to take a more detailed history. They put more facts into their note. They do connect with the patient a lot better. So their race does play a role in how doctor-patient care goes.
Absolutely. Have any of the other people on the panel had to advocate for their patients more because they were Black, or felt that they were being mistreated because they were Black? Poonam, I see you nodding your head.
Oh gosh, so much. And, Sonia and I talk about this, we work together a lot. When you're dealing with patients who are primarily African American and considering always the history that brought them to this point, like why they're seeking medical care, like the biases that they have towards a medical establishment, as you said, the fact that maybe sometimes they're not going to tell you the whole story the first time around because they're worried how you're going to perceive them. There's so much in there. And then you have to deal occasionally in speaking with consultants who let their own implicit biases show, when you're discussing a patient's care plan because of maybe the environment or lack of resources that patient has, especially training at Grady, a lot of people who might be homeless, who might not have all the same accesses to resources or the same knowledge of their body or medical terminology. And sometimes you have to go that extra step and you have to understand to see each patient in their own context. I remember taking care of a Black woman once who was brought in by two white paramedics for shortness of breath, and no one even started an IV on her. Wow. And her daughters were in the room, and I asked the paramedics to exit the room because I said, if you couldn't do this to bring her here, then you're just taking up space, and we need you to leave the room. But you see that all the time, and you see the daughters look at you. I'm brown. I've been called Mexican. I've been called Middle Eastern. I kind of fit a lot of ethnic morphologies, which works to my advantage because they just know, okay, she's a person of color. She has some sympathy towards us.
Fair enough. What about your experiences?
Well, I think for me, one thing I look at it like, besides working at Grady and seeing the issue that, dealing with, and as a cardiologist, African American are more risk of dying from heart disease and stroke, is more so like, medicine has an issue. We've been talking for the last 30 years about diversity and increasing number of Black doctors, but your study shows like we have the lowest number of Black male doctors in the history. It's shocking to me. What happened to all the pipeline diversity initiative for the last 30 years? Well, this $1 billion we're investing in all these institutions. if you already think about it, actually, it's not a race complete issue. It's actually a socioeconomic status issue. Less than 10% of medical students come from the lowest bracket of this country, which doesn't make sense. Which means is if we're gonna only like recruit racial diversity and not and contribute the socioeconomic status to it, then we're missing a lot of people who will go back into the community and help out. And that's why a lot of my work is focused on inspiring more diversity in medicine by focusing on underserved communities. If you go to underserved community, you most likely find a lot of African American, a lot of Hispanic, a lot of immigrants. If you focus on that spectrum, you're actually serving a lot of people, which you actually end up serving the whole country. So I think medicine has not only an issue with like racism and discrimination, is more so I think an issue of diversity and what metric we're using to improve diversity. If you're gonna, I mean, I'll give you an example. I went to Morehouse Medical School. I was a Grady patient, and my Grady patient was talking about like they couldn't afford the $4 medication. My colleague, who was a Morehouse student, because she came from a very privileged background, she made a comment. She's like, I don't understand how they can't afford the $4 medication. I'm like, I understand. I work for $5.
This is the black doctor?
She was a medical student, like a colleague of mine. She's like, I don't get it how they don't think. I'm like, well, you live in your parents are physicians. I could see why you don't get it. And it made sense to me. Is socioeconomic status is a lot of the background of these issues. And if we attach that to like diversity, racial and, women and all of that, you see that it's actually very well connected, right? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I don't think you're wrong. I think it's important to consider that, because I think when we talk about diversity, we often think black, white, or we're just talking about race. But there's a lot of different diversity. There's socioeconomic diversity. There's diversity in gender. There's diversity in sexual orientation. It's about making sure that all different types of people are invited to the conversation. But that notwithstanding, I do believe that even just somebody who looks like you makes a big difference in that patient encounter. I think that it's important that they also understand what your background and, maybe have people who have known what it is to not be able to afford $4 of medication. I think that's very important too. But I think that I'm going to go back to the notion that color matters, race matters, ethnicity matters too. And so speaking about race and ethnicity, we know, in addition to heart disease, which you mentioned, Hival, we know that Black and brown people are disproportionately affected by coronavirus for a number of reasons that we're not going to get into in this show. But I wanted to talk about coronavirus because insofar as we're talking about race and viruses that are, or let me put it this way, insofar as we're talking about racism, which I believe is a virus that is destroying the fabric of this nation, I compare it to coronavirus because I think that it is destroying the fabric of this nation. I think it is separating us in ways that are really inexplicable and inexcusable. And I hate the fact that just like there are people who deny the existence of racism and deny that it's a problem, there are also people who deny that coronavirus is a problem. And so I wanted to just talk a little bit about what's going on with coronavirus. As of today, roughly 14 million cases of coronavirus exist worldwide, and there's been over 600,000 deaths. And in the US alone, there are roughly 3.7 million cases with, at this point, over 140,000 deaths. And please keep in mind that those deaths and those numbers have just been in the past 5 months. Now, other things that have come up recently, there was a recent study that was showing that up to 85 infants were diagnosed with coronavirus in Texas. A lot of people have questions about kids and coronavirus and whether they can get it and what impact it has on them. And there's a lot that we still don't understand, but we do know that children, even infants, can contract it. And there have been some cases where infants have contracted it in utero. So when they were born, they tested positive for it. We do know that masks help to stop the spread of coronavirus. And I want to just bring up the fact that in the state of Georgia, in which most of us reside, there is an ongoing battle about wearing masks, as there is throughout the country. And our mayor in Atlanta, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, has mandated masks in the city of Atlanta. And the governor of Georgia, Governor Brian Kemp, is now suing her. We at When Docs Talk strongly believe that masks can help stop the spread of coronavirus, and we support wearing masks. We completely negate the notion that they cause health problems for people, but we do know that coronavirus will definitely cause the same health problems that people are scared about. The last thing I'm going to say about coronavirus, is that we really need to continue to advocate that people avoid crowded places, avoid close contact settings, and avoid confined and enclosed spaces, in addition to wearing masks. We've got to slow the spread of this disease. It is real. It affects everybody, every socioeconomic class. We've had prime ministers and presidents of certain countries who have this disease, and we have people in the inner cities, in the rural areas. It doesn't spare anybody. It should not be a political issue. It should not be an issue that divides us. It should be an issue that unites us. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, it is not. I want to also add that we at When Docs Talk will be talking a little bit more about coronavirus, and we want to get your opinion. Viewers, let us know on our website what aspect of it you'd like us to talk about. I've had some people say they want to talk about masks more and have the debate about whether masks should be enforced. I've had others talk about their anxieties regarding school. You know, school's about to start for children, and a lot of parents, like myself, are very anxious about the decision as to whether they're to send their children back or not, although several schools have already kind of made that decision for us in the state of Georgia. So let us know what's on your mind, but coronavirus is real. I want to now circle back to our guests and thank you all sincerely for joining us on When Docs Talk. We appreciate your insight, your opinions, your diversity, just being who you are and being from a different place, different backgrounds. We love that. We celebrate that. And we respect your opinions. Do any of you have any last words that you want to leave our viewers with?
I was just going to add, I was really listening to the conversation you guys were just having about COVID and just sort of your experience as physicians. And I think the thing that it made me think about was what we started with, the definition of racism, systemic, right? You were talking about all of the ways in which the systems conspire to pile on disadvantage against certain communities. And I think that it's just really important to really remember that, like, one of the things that we found out with COVID is the disproportionate impact that it's having on the Black community. And so much of that is just deeply rooted in like a history of being excluded from the healthcare system, you know, being excluded from the economic system, being largely excluded from educational systems. Like, this is what we're talking about when we say that the problem is systemic, and that while your feelings about it are interesting, they are not the most important thing, right?
Right.
You know, and I think that, like, you guys have just laid out the case so much. So I'm deeply grateful to all of you as physicians being able to influence in that sector, because I know so many Black friends and family members, especially older, who are deeply ambivalent and distrustful of the medical system. And this is how we end up in these situations. And I have to say, a big part of the cavalierness that it seems like the US has taken towards Corona, I wonder how much of it is because we know that it's disproportionately impacting Black people, and therefore less people care. I just want people to think about, is that anything?
I never even thought about it that way, but I think that for some circles, it could absolutely be that. In fact, wait, you know what? I have thought about it because I did see a quote where somebody actually expressed what you've just stated. This is not a problem. It's actually affecting minorities, and maybe we shouldn't cure it. Obviously, a very big racist, but I have seen that perspective, and it's one to keep in mind with this. So thank you so much, Kamala. Any last words, Poonam?
I just want to say thank you so much. This is a beautiful show. I so appreciate the invitation to be here. I have learned so much from all of you, and there's a lot of work still to be done. So as you know, John Lewis said, let's keep focusing on the good trouble.
Yes. Thanks so much, Poonam. Jose, how about you?
I wanted to say thank you. I feel honored to be on this panel, and I think this right here is our main strength, this diversity, having people come in and talk and share their ideas and finding solutions for moving ahead and going forward. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Aval?
Oh, thank you so much for having me here. And I think that's important for all of us to recognize, like, injustice against anyone, is just injustice against all of us too. So we need to stand up for people who are being discriminated against and oppressed, because if you don't stand up for anyone, nobody will stand up for you when the time comes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Aval. Bal?
I just have to say that I'm honored to be part of this panel. You guys are wonderful, not just the panel, but also all the viewers. Everyone wants to take action, and I think you guys are the ones that are going to make the change. Everyone stay safe, stay healthy. And thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to bring on Morgan. Thank you all to all our guests. I just want us to close with a few words from our hosts.
Yes.
I just want to say,
Oh, go ahead.
I just want to thank everyone who was able to make it and add to our discussion. I was reading a lot of the comments, and everyone was appreciative of all the perspectives and all the information shared today. Thank you, everyone.
Sonia.
Yes, and I want to thank everyone, and I just wanted to put out a quote. It's a sermon that Bishop William J. Barber, he will campaign, but one of the things he was saying, to be moved with compassion is the only cure.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes so far from the standpoint of even what we're talking about with Black Lives Matters, but even with the mask, moving forward, I know we're going to be talking about it a little bit further on another show, but even from the standpoint of using masks, we know that it can prevent spreading it and harming someone else. And the other thing is too, just when you go out there in the world, you're going to those stores and people are telling you, hey, will you wear your mask when you're going in the store? Don't get mad. Don't yell at them. Yeah. They're doing their job, and actually they're risking their lives from the standpoint of being out there day to day, doing the things that we need to provide a service for us. So please, I've just seen stories where people are being mean, hateful, yelling, trying to beat them up. Just have some compassion, especially for the people that are working in the grocery stores and all of those stores that we go to on a daily basis. They can't stay at home. They have to go to work. And then if they're sick, a lot of times, that's hard for them economically if they can't be there and be at work. So just some compassion.
Absolutely. I just have two things to close. The first is that I remember a quote, I think it was from National Junior Honor Society or something like that, but it still resonates to me today. Alone, we are but one small flickering candle, but together we can light the darkness. We can light the darkness. We have a lot of big shoes to fill with some of the people who have been in our past who literally dedicated their lives to making it possible for us to live better as Black people, brown people, white people, all Americans. I want us to remember that when we all live better, no matter who you are, it's good for all of us. When Black lives matter, all lives will matter. Yeah. We respect all lives here at WDT. And I want us to respect the fact that togetherness, unity is what's going to lift us out of the darkness. The second thing is a quote from Hebrews 13:3 says that remember also those being mistreated as if you felt their pain in your own bodies. Yeah. We have to remember our brothers and sisters and feel their own pain in order for us to live better. We can't always be thinking about me, us. When we open our eyes and we allow ourselves to feel each other's pain, that is when we will be better as a people. And I think that's when people will stop getting upset with, being asked to wear a mask. And that's when people will start thinking about the struggles that others in this society, including Black people, have had. And so those are the only things that come to mind as I close. And I hope that our viewers have enjoyed this discussion. I want to also close by just dedicating this show to the loving memory of my cousin, Akanimo Ikwe Akan, who passed just about 2 weeks ago. We will never forget him. Make sure you love your loved ones, hold them close to you. In times like these, in times of confusion, in times when the world kind of seems like a strange place, remember to reach out to each other because nothing is promised. On that note, I thank you again for joining us at When Docs Talk. Catch our next episode in 2 weeks. We'll be talking about strategies. We talked about stories. We talked about supporters. Now, what are we supposed to do? Because we don't want this conversation to end. We don't want this fight to die with our leaders dying, and we don't want the different things, coronavirus or whatever else is happening in the world, to stop the momentum and to stop the conversation. This conversation is not over. Thank you so much. Stay blessed, and we'll see you next time.